what is like to emerge out of this current structural crisis? Could China, for example, provide new leadership for global capitalism, and then provide new solutions and lead global capitalism into a new era? Now, if we look at this so-called Chinese economic miracle, and in fact, the basis of this economic miracle has been very simple. It rests upon three pillars. First of all, it rests upon the exploitation, very intense exploitation of a large, cheap labor force. But when you exploit a large, cheap labor force, how do you solve the demand problem? Because workers cannot consume, right? So how do you solve the demand problem? So for China, to a large extent, it depends on the exports to the Western capitalist economies. Then thirdly, because China is said to have become the factory of the world. So in other words, China specializes in manufacturing exports, which is resources and energy intensive. So it needs to be supplied by massive amounts of energy and natural resources. But now, basically, all three pillars are in serious trouble. First of all, we know that with the Western capitalist economies in stagnation, China basically could no longer rely upon exports to Western capitalist economies. And then instead, if you look at this dark line, which shows the share of investment in the Chinese capitalist economy, which is now rising to almost 50% of the Chinese economy. So China has to depend more and more on investment. But the problem of investment is that over time you create increasingly more excess productive capacity, which cannot be sustained. So if you look at the loss of the capitalist media, so many people these days are talking about whether the Chinese economy can be rebalanced. That is to be rebalanced from an economy that is based primarily on investment exports towards consumption. But can China manage to increase consumption? Can China use consumption as a way to lead its economic expansion? So this graph basically shows the relationship between China's household consumption, which is the green line, and the labor income as a share of China's GDP. I guess even for non-expert, you can see quite closely, these two lines are closely correlated, right? And so basically both the labor income and consumption as a share of China's economic output has more or less consistent decline. Now has fallen to the incredibly low level of about 35% of China's GDP. Now by my own calculation, even from a capitalist point of view, to have a somewhat sustainable capitalist economy from a purely economic perspective, you need to lower the share of investment by about 20% of China's GDP. So it follows, you need to increase the share of consumption by about 20% of GDP. And so in other words, you need to increase the share of wage by about 20% of GDP. That is very, very large. So, will the Chinese capitalist class accept such a large adjustment in income distribution? Now, yesterday, Pepe in his introduction comments talk about that one of the paradoxes of China has to do with, on the one hand, China depends on fossil fuels for its economy, and on the other hand, China is said to be developing the green energy very rapidly, leading the world's green energy development. Now to make a very simplified point, there's no paradox here. The first part is true. The second part is myth. Now China depends on coal for about 3/4 of its energy. That creates two problems. One is that coal is a non-renewable resource. Coal is a non-renewable resource, right? And so I have done some research. So China's coal production might peak around 2030. So from a purely resource perspective, that could create an insurmountable obstacle to China's capitalist accumulation. But moreover, we know that the consumption of fossil fuels, especially coal, would generate greenhouse gas emissions, and that in the long run would create global ecological catastrophes. So even though China's coal could reach the peak production around 2030s, the emission of greenhouse emissions from coal consumption alone, based on this projection, over the course of 21st century, would amount to about 240 billion tons. And then would amount to about 500 billion tons. Right? And then if you assume China's coal emissions amount to about 20% of the global emissions, that would represent about 2.5 trillion tons. And that alone would imply a long-term global warming of about 3.5 degrees. Now, if you have been following this climate literature, you know that there's this general understanding that if global warming is beyond 2 degrees, it would lead to unimaginable climate catastrophes. All right, so what will be the hope for China as well as the world? Now, Marx talked about that the proletariat would become the grave diggers of the capitalist system. Of course, the proletariat so far has not yet become the grave diggers of capitalism. And instead, over the course of 20th century, the working class struggle forced capitalists to make some concessions that led to the creation of the welfare state institutions. But now we know that this historical social compromise is falling apart in all the Western capital countries. And moreover, the rise of new